everybody hear me? Does it work? I have a feeling that I want to start by voicing out a question, and I will need for the answer a show of hands. How many times people who have been here many times and have participated at the CSW, please show a raise of hands. Yeah, that's a question. How many times did you experience hearing about a blocked resolution or difficult negotiations or dead end or bringing the resolutions to the bare minimum that is almost good for nothing? Show of hands, please. All right. So this is what we want to resolve today. We don't want to describe the dead end as much as we want to know via our workshop today women's rights between political interests and religious discourse. We want to reach entry points where this dialogue that is necessary and that gets stalled 1 year after the other with the same issues being risen over and over again, this dialogue would need to actually take place and in depth. For that, I would like to introduce myself first. I am Iman Mandour. I am from Sula, from Egypt, and it's not my first time here. I have, like the many show of hands, experienced this hardship of negotiations that reached not nice ends 1 year after the other. And we have with us today many speakers actually who are going to talk to us about this issue and raise the awareness about some entry points that would be possible to initiate the dialogue actually from different points of view. From the international level, what has been done and what could be done, and from on a national level, and from the religious discourse level. And maybe if we have time, after the speakers speak, we can get to Azza Suleiman from Sula as well, to maybe highlight some of the laws where this discourse has been used to make a real change in Egypt, so that we also have a national legal point of view. We're starting by Zena Anwar. Zena is from Malaysia. She's the co-founder and director of Musawa. And she's going to tell us about things that she told me when we have met in Geneva. We were there because we were part of the NGO delegation that Afef took part here of to discuss the Egyptian report at the CEDAW committee. So there was nothing really planned with Musawa there, and I bumped into Zena and I was asking her, Zena, what brought you here? What are you doing at the CEDAW? And she said, you know, we are starting a dialogue with the CEDAW committee to raise the awareness on issues of Sharia and women's rights and so on. They're doing extremely interesting work with this regard, and I will leave the floor to Zena to tell us about it.
Thank you very much, Iman. I'm going to share with you this research project that we did on CEDAW and Muslim family law and our interventions in Geneva to really advance the rights of women living in Muslim contexts and really deal with how governments use Islam to enter their reservations and to justify why they cannot. because they cannot move forward, you know, on and why they can't move forward on their treaty obligations. So this is, you know, for those of you who are not familiar with Musawa, quickly, Musawa is a global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family, initiated by Sisters in Islam in Malaysia, and now work at the international level, really trying to bridge the gap, the binary, often constructed binary between Islam and human rights, Islam and women's rights, religion and secularism, you know, all these binaries that divide us, and trying to bring all that together towards a common objective of course, equality, justice, you know, for women. And the third objective, this work, the international advocacy work, is really addressing the third objective of Musawa, which is to support the work of human rights mechanisms and those engaged with the process to advance equality and justice in the Muslim family. And it was a big, huge, ambitious research to better understand how state parties use Islam and Sharia law to justify reservations to CEDAW and non-compliance with treaty obligations, and to really promote the Musawa framework, and I'll take you through that, as an approach that can bridge the divide between Islam and women's rights. And we looked at 40 OIC countries. OIC is the Organization of Islamic Conference. 40 OIC countries that reported between 2005 and 2010, and 2 non-OIC countries with significant Muslim minorities, India and Singapore. And for each country, we examined 7 documents. So it was a massive research project, looking at state party reports, looking at CEDAW reports, looking at summary records of constructive engagement, looking at concluding observations, and looking at the NGO shadow reports and oral statements. And basically, you know, 57 OIC countries all have ratified CEDAW, except for those 3 countries. 29 ratified without reservations. Many people forget, you know, just this assumption, you're Islam, you're Muslim, therefore you will have reservations. No. Most of them African and Central Asian. 28 ratified with reservations. All the MENA countries except Yemen ratified with reservations. And the most reserved articles are Article 16 on marriage and family. All 28 countries reserve whole or parts of Article 16, Article 9 on nationality, Article 5 on social and cultural patterns, Article 2, you know, taking measures to eliminate discrimination against women. And I want to take you through the kinds of, you know, because of shortage of time, this is a massive project, and I really don't have time to take you through, so I have like, I'm running through to give you an idea, but the reports are available on the Musawa website in English, Arabic, and French. Maybe we've not done French, English and Arabic. So just sample the kind of language used by Muslim governments, OIC governments. Example, Morocco on Article 16. So you kind of like notice the trends and how they justify why, you know, they should be exempted from their treaty obligations. On issue of rights and responsibilities to enter into marriage and dissolution of marriage, that this kind of equality is considered incompatible with Sharia. And that what Sharia provides is a framework of equilibrium. So you see this a lot in the CEDAW process when government says this is not discrimination. This is complementarity. This is to maintain equilibrium in the family relationship, because men have different roles, women have different roles, children have different roles, you know. So to maintain the equilibrium, to preserve the sacred bond of matrimony. Egypt's reservations, you know, women are accorded rights equivalent. That's another common word used. It's not discrimination, it's equivalence. You know, to maintain a just balance. All these wonderful words that's being used to justify the reservations. Respect for the sacrosanct nature of religious belief. You know, Islamic law cannot be called into question, it's divine law. Again, you see the argument of complementarity, and this complementarity of the man providing and protecting, the woman obeying the man. This guarantees true equality. So this wonderful fiction, Cloud Cuckoo Land, you know, that's spoken at in the UN system here by governments. And then we look at the language used in the country reports. that's submitted to the CEDAW committee. So some of the arguments use Sharia, so in many Muslim countries, in all these countries with reservations, Sharia is a source of law, defining rights, duties, and responsibilities of men and women in the family. It's a settled matter. It's divine law, it cannot be changed. So don't question, don't challenge, you can't reform. The countries cannot implement these treaty obligations if they're inconsistent, or in conflict with Islam or Sharia. Another line of argument is we don't need to comply with CEDAW because Islam actually gives superior justice for women. All the argument of complementarities of rights and duties between men and women. Another line of argument is culture, customs, traditions prevent full implementation. And these are usually done by governments with minority Muslim population, where the Muslim population, Muslim women, do not enjoy equal rights that the women of other faith enjoy. And the reasons the government give is that it is not us that is against the reform. The community is not ready, and because we respect culture, customs, and tradition, we cannot impose it on the community until they are ready. But when governments want to spend 80% of the budget on weapons of war, nobody thinks about the community, right? So what Musawa does, after analyzing the language used by governments, is we provide the Musawa framework for action to push, to argue for the possibility and necessity of reform in Islamic family law and the possibility of justice and equality in Islam. And to introduce this language and this conceptual tool, juristic arguments in Geneva to the CEDAW committee experts, so that there's more constructive engagement with the governments when the governments report. Because very often in the UN system, when governments fly the flag of religion, and Islam in particular, everybody goes catatonic and, oh, that's your culture, that's your religion, you deal with it. And there's really no constructive engagement, that can push the debate forward and the discourse forward. So just quickly, the Musawa framework for action is a holistic framework that grounds our demands for reform at 4 levels: Islamic teachings, universal human rights principles, fundamental rights and constitutional guarantees of equality and non-discrimination. And many Muslim countries do have this constitutional provision. But, when it comes to Islam and women, that's an excuse, like exception. And the lived realities, the importance of the changing realities of family life today, of women's lives today, to argue for change. And we provide the historical, jurisprudential, and sociological outline to support the assertion that equality and justice in the family are necessary and possible. And there are certain, I don't want to go into details because we don't have time, certain conceptual tools, distinction between what is Sharia, which is revelation, God's words, what is fiqh, which is jurisprudence constructed by human beings, not fallible, socially constructed, therefore able to change given changing times and circumstances. Categories of legal rulings: mu'amalat and ibadah. Ibadah regulates relationship between you and God, mu'amala between human beings. And family law, Islamic family law, is not divine law. It regulates, it's man-made, it regulates relation between human beings and is open to change. The tradition of ikhtilaf, diversity of opinion, that has always existed in the Islamic tradition. There's always diversity of opinion. On what basis does the state choose the most discriminatory opinion to codify into law? We challenge that. And that basically the argument that, that these laws are man-made. And the assertion that it has a life of its own. And the assertion that really in the 21st century, there cannot be justice without equality. And that the many principles in the Quran, justice, equality, human dignity, love and compassion, these are wonderful verses that exist in the Quran that talks about the relationship between men and women. On what basis do the ulama, the religious authorities, choose a discriminatory verse to frame the whole family law. So we're questioning the production of knowledge, how knowledge is interpreted, how the Quran is interpreted, and how that which interpretation is used as a source of law and public policy. I don't want to go through all those juristic principles of diversity of opinion, public interest, and all that. And so basically we challenge the way the state parties use this reciprocity, complementarity arguments, and on that basis that this is not, they argue it is not inequality. And basically it was our response that, look, this is a legal fiction. Okay? State parties fail to point out that legally the reciprocity argument between husband and wife is defined as husbands provide maintenance, wives obey husbands. No obedience, no maintenance. Who decides there's no obedience? Yeah? And that really this kind of a relationship is founded on inequality. Men's responsibilities lead to privileges and rights at the expense of women. Men get double the share of inheritance, right to divorce the woman at will, right to demand obedience, right to guardianship of children. All these assumptions, are unjust to women. And this position doesn't correspond with reality. Fewer men are sole providers and protectors of the family. Women are providers and protectors of the family. The rights and privileges today as well are no longer linked. Men who fail to provide, and we know many men who fail to provide, do not get punished or lose their privileges to right to guardianship, right to double the share of inheritance. And women who do provide still are expected to obey the husband. There is basically a disconnect between the legal framework and the reality of family life today. So we point this out to the CEDAW committee and get them to push this with the governments. The CEDAW committee also deals with all the issues of discrimination. For example, polygamy. The state parties will argue this is a right in Islam, cannot be questioned. And we say, look, there are verses in the Quran that says if you feel you cannot do justice, marry only one, and that will be best for you. On what basis did the state choose this marry 2, 3, or 4 instead of marry one? Who has the authority to decide which interpretation is used? So these are the kinds of arguments at the Islamic level that we use. Then of course, I won't go through the human rights principles, the constitutional guarantees, and of course the lived realities evidence where we will bring forward the disadvantages, the suffering of women and children in polygamous marriages to justify, our call. And then we also provide good practices table for the CEDAW committee members. What are the best practices in different Muslim countries on the issue of polygamy or minimum age of marriage, on all these issues, to show that this is not divine law. There's diversity and differences. On what basis then this government picks this law and not this law? Okay, so those examples, Tunisia, basis of Islamic argument, polygamy is banned. Do you say Tunisia is an infidel country, an Islamic country? So from that research, we turn it to action. So today, to just end, we submit thematic reports, regular thematic reports to the CEDAW committee on Article 16 on marriage and family when key Muslim countries are reporting. We issue oral statements, we lobby the CEDAW committee members, and we engage with the NGOs in their preparation of shadow reports. And just quickly, the impact of our work, you see the changing discourse in the constructive engagement with the government. CEDAW committee members now begin to use the language that we use, the difference between Sharia and fiqh. So basically challenge the government, it's not Sharia, it's not divine law, this is jurisprudence, you can change it. It's a question of interpretation. There are diverse interpretations. Why do you choose the most discriminatory interpretation? They point out to best practices in other Muslim countries. The question now began, we're really happy that they're beginning to question governments on the complementarity language. So women now provide, what do? Shouldn't your legal framework change? So you see these changes. And in the concluding comments as well, you see the change in language. CEDAW committee now criticize government for using restrictive interpretation. So the word interpretation, progressive interpretation, all that has entered into the language and really pushing the governments, to recognize that change is possible and change is necessary. Okay, and and basically we really, in the engagement, we really push the CEDAW committee to really recognize that there's diversity of voices that exist in Muslim communities within the Islamic tradition. And when government says, we're not ready. It's not us that don't want to change, it's the Muslim community that's not ready to change. To really ask the governments, which voice in the community are you giving legitimacy to? Which voice in the community are you listening? There are all these women's groups in Geneva lobbying for change, but these are not legitimate voices, but the voices of the conservative patriarchs and religious authorities, is that the only legitimate voice? So to really begin to grill governments for a more constructive engagement and to take place. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaina, very much for telling us that there is hope of that we have at least this expertise that is already engaged. يا حبلة يعني. أعمل إيه؟
You could use that.
Use that.
Right. Okay? Yeah, that's better. That's much better. Yeah, so at least that we have the expertise that is already engaged in this very technical dialogue, so that, you know, we don't have this phenomenon of hands up because we said it is, the state says it is against religion, or hands up because another state is saying it is culture specific. I mean, these two arguments are being used over and over again, and it's very good that to know that this expertise is there, and it's up to us, you know, to continue pushing and suggesting for that. So now Marwa, I have come across Marwa in the peak of the activity that she was facilitating. She was really hands-on in working with various NGOs, comparing laws around the Islamic countries. This clause in this country is as such, and it's forbidding so, but the other country is permitting so, and she used this information and content in facilitating a process with Egyptian NGOs and coalition who gathered together to put a new family law that is based on very progressive interpretation of the Sharia. And also she's a board member of Musawa, a global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. And she has a PhD from Oxford University, law faculty of the interaction between Islamic law and human rights. Marwa, they say it's carved in stone. And that they cannot do anything about it. Did they stand by this argument? Or can you prove otherwise?
I'll try to prove otherwise. Okay, so I hope everyone can hear me. Anyway, I have a very loud voice, so it's okay. Usually, I'm going to talk about Egypt. I'm going to use it as a case study. And I think it could be a very similar experience in most of our countries, where we all have this equation. When you put political interests of certain of the elites, the political elites in any country, plus religion, usually the end of this equation is very regressive policies for women. At least that's the case in Egypt. So what I'm trying to say is that a new equation is possible, actually. You can have political interests and you can add religion to that, but that can result in actually quite progressive policies and laws for women. And I'm going to try to show you why I think I'm right. Number one, political interests are really shaped by the power dynamics and balance of power in any given context. And women's movements are really part of that. And they can exert pressure to affect the political will. Okay, so that's the political interests part of the equation. We can have a say in it. The second part of the equation is religion. And what I'm trying to say is that religion is indeed flexible, at least in the case of Islamic law, and accommodative of progressive changes in women's status. So when you have progressive interpretations, you have political interests that are being shaped by the women themselves on the ground, putting pressure on their governments and their states, you can actually have good progressive laws that affect women positively. Now I want to start, actually, can we go back to your Egypt reservation, if possible? I want to start by the Egyptian reservation on Article 16. And I'll read the part of it while Zaina brings it out. So, reservation to the text of Article 16 concerning the equality of men and women in all matters relating to marriage and family relations during the marriage and upon its dissolution. Listen to this. Without prejudice to the Islamic Sharia provisions, whereby women are accorded rights equivalent to those of their spouses, so as to ensure a just balance between them. Listen to the coming sentence. This is out of respect for the sacrosanct nature of the firm religious beliefs which govern marital relations in Egypt and which may not be called to question. Okay? What do you get out of this reservation? Religion is untouchable. Religion is fixed. You can't do anything about it. It's because of religion that the situation as it is in Egypt. That's what you get, right? Now, in Egypt's last CEDAW session, which we all had the privilege together to be in as part of the NGO delegation, some committee members started voicing awareness of an alternative Islamic discourse. And Zaina showed us some of the quotes that supports non-discrimination and empowerment of women. So, for example, one of them was asking the government official, she was telling him there was scope to develop a progressive, feminist, and non-discriminatory interpretation of Islamic tenets. It would be interesting to know of any debate or specific ideas to promote such an interpretation and amend legislation. Indeed, Musawa's research, which Zaina just talked to us about, shows that really, if you want to use religion as a source of equality, as a source of empowerment, as a source of gender justice, you can definitely do it. You can work from within the tradition. You can work from within the Quran, the Hadith, the Sunnah, to be able to push forth interpretations that treat men and women equally. This seriously puts into question Egypt's assertion that family matters based on religion are of a sacrosanct nature and are not to be questioned, as the reservation says, because of this alternative jurisprudence that we have. I'm going to take two examples from the Egyptian experience. A law called, popularly known as Jihan's law. Jihan is Sadat, the wife of Anwar al-Sadat. And it's law number 44, 1979. And I'm going to compare, and I'm going to also use another law, more recent, that was passed in the year 2000. And it's important to see the context in which these laws were passed by the Egyptian government. So Jihan's law in 1979 was passed in a particular political context where the Islamists, political Islam was rising. And Sadat was using them politically to get back at the Nasserist opposition he had locally, nationally in Egypt. So he was supporting the Islamists to come up because he did not want the Nasserists to be as strong as they were. But at the same time, he was playing this carrot and stick game, political game with them. So he passed, for example, an amendment to the constitution, the Egyptian constitution, to say that Sharia is the main principle of legislation in Egypt. It was not like this before. It was just one of the many sources of legislation. But to appease the Islamists, he changed that part in the constitution. But at the same time, he had to also use the stick, because they were becoming very popular, especially among women. So what they did was pass what came to be known as Jihan's law, the wife, of Sadat. And although far from revolutionary, the new law brought some benefits to women. It specified that if a wife went out to work without the husband's consent, her right to maintenance would not be affected. It also exempted wives whose husbands were polygamous and who wanted to seek divorce as a result. It exempted them from proving the harm caused to them by the husband's remarriage. The new law stipulated that a wife would lose her right to maintenance if her disobedience was proved, but there could be no resort to forceful executions of obedience rulings made against the wife, because before that, the police could actually go to the wife, forcefully bring her back to the house, the marital home, whether she likes it or not. So this law actually made it very clear that this is no longer acceptable, even though she is still obliged to obey the husband by the law. So I'm telling you, this law made some advancement, but it's really far, far from what we want or aspire to. Also, mothers under this new law were able to keep custody of their children for a longer period, and many similar advancements took place. Now, Sadat was a very shrewd politician. He was very careful to seek the endorsement of the highest official religious authorities in Egypt. So the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar, the Minister of Religious Trusts, and the Grand Mufti of Egypt. Nevertheless, despite all these grand imams supporting, there was still very vicious attacks on this law based on Islamic arguments. So on one hand, Islam is being used to support such advancement, and you have the Grand Mufti, the Grand Imam supporting, but on the other, there's another faction of imams as well who were against this law, again using the same Islam. What happened was that the law passed, but at any rate, after Sadat died, the Constitutional Court repealed the law, not on Islamic legal grounds, on procedural grounds. And we all know that this was a kind of excuse, okay? So this law was eventually repealed. And I want to, this is one case study. Another case study is the law number 1 for the year 2000, and it's commonly known as the Khula' law. So legally speaking, a woman is not able to seek divorce. A man, it's very easy for a man in Egypt to divorce. All he does is just to say, I divorce you. The guy doesn't need even to go to work, to court. He doesn't need to express any reasons. He just says, I divorce you. Now, for a woman to divorce, she actually needs to go to court. She has only 6 reasons through which she can seek divorce, and it's the judge who conducts the divorce. So there's a clear case of inequality here, okay? Now, again, let's look at the political context of law number 1 to the year 2000. Egypt was about to come to Geneva to give its periodical report for CEDAW in the year 2001, I think. And it was very important for the Egyptian state to give a modern face to the world, to say, here, okay, we are actually doing legal changes that are modern, that give women their rights and all that. So they passed something, an Islamic mechanism called Khula', by which a woman does not have to express any reasons to seek divorce. She still has to go to court, though. And the judge is the one who actually divorces her. But she does not have to express any reasons, which in such a context was quite an achievement, unfortunately. So again, look at the political context and how the Egyptian state managed to dig out from the Islamic legal resources that we have this solution. To be able to say, look, we're good with our women, we're making legal changes, we're paying political costs. Again, this law, even though it came from the Islamic legal tradition, so much opposition came to it on the basis of Islam. And it's because traditionally in the jurisprudence, classical jurisprudence, the consent of the husband was usually important in the khula' procedure. What the Egyptian government did was a complete innovation, very new. Not very new, some other countries did that and some jurisprudence did that, but it was a minority opinion, whereby the consent of the husband was not important. The woman just has to go to court, says, I don't want to live with this guy anymore, I have no reasons, I don't need to give you reasons, I want out. And the judge gives her the divorce. So what the Egyptian state did in this case was to innovate, to come up with new Islamic solutions, because it had an incentive. They were going next year to Geneva to prove a certain point, all right? So again, you see in these two cases, these two laws, always religion was used by the opposition, but also by the state to prove the point. This is very important. And it is telling that all interlocutors participating in these debates always resorted to the religious discourse to justify their positions. However, it would be inaccurate to conclude that it was a contestation over which interpretation of Sharia's injunction on family relations was the correct one. This is not a fight about religion. Religion is actually being used here, all right? And Mulki Shurmeni writes, and she says that instead, it's not a fight about religion, instead a myriad of concerns and fears that are related to changing socioeconomic conditions, painful and uneven transformation of gender roles and relations, and struggles between different entities in the society, such as the government and the religious establishment, over the scope and significance of their role, their power, their control over society in shaping the cultural and social reproduction of society. So my conclusion really is, and I will end with that, is that in both cases, the Khul'a law 2000 and Jihan's law 1979, the relationship between religion and women was forged, hijacked, affected by what seemed to be the more important political situation and context at hand. Women and their rights were subject to the politicians' own power agenda. And I'm not talking just about the politicians in power, I'm also talking about the leaders of the religious establishment as well. In both cases, advancement was made, although not revolutionary for women, so that's the second point. In both cases, religion proved malleable enough to accommodate the state's intention. And we see that, and this is something I forgot to tell you, that for the Khul'a law actually to happen, a group of activists, lawyers, judges, progressive people came together, and for 9 years they kept working for it, they kept pushing for it. And then the state took it in and adopted it as a law. So it's very important to realize that there is space, we have a say in this. We can put pressure, we can do activism. And there is space for women's movements to mobilize women in order to exert pressure on the state to appropriate religion in a way that is gender sensitive. And you find that, for example, the family law in Morocco, which is hailed now in the Arab world as one of the most progressive Muslim family laws. Everyone says it's because of the king. The king is progressive, he passed it. But what few people say is that before the king passed that law in 2004, for 20 years, the women's movement was working very hard on that law. The king would not have been able to do that without the 20 years of work that the women's movement did. So I end with my proposal that you can have an equation where there are political interests, you can have religion, and that will eventually, very, very possibly lead you to have very progressive laws and policies for women. And I have hope that we will do it as well in Egypt, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marwa, from digging in the Egyptian history and showing that it was not carved in stone, that over time again, it was very moldable, adaptable, and that from within this arena you can find solutions that are in compliance with the rights agenda. And now we're going to leave a little bit the secular versus religious dichotomy or polarity and this kind of dialogue, and we will go with Gamal Omar, who is an Egyptian writer. Gamal is working extensively on the legacy of Dr. Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid. And the importance of the work of Dr. Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid is that he is providing a religious discourse input that also can demonstrate this modality of malleability and adaptability, and a research from a religious scholar himself within the religious interpretations themselves. And we're going to go to this trip with Gamal Omar, who's going to introduce to us this aspect of the work of Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid.
Thank you very much for coming and attending. And in the beginning, I'm trying to I want to thank Azza for the invitation. And I was thinking to start or to begin with complaining about my mom and my sisters and their discrimination against me for 26 years. Deny me a joy who I discovered when I came to the United States there. But I'm going to leave that to the questions and answer after. The issue I'm trying to shed some light on, the issue of the meaning of a scripture or a text. Where did the meaning come from in a scripture or a text? Is the meaning inside the scripture itself, and we're just going to go inside and take it, or it has another source? And I'm going to stand in front of a constitutional text or the independence of the United States, how many years ago? When the sentence said, every man created equal. And the interpretation and understanding of this sentence was just for WASP men. Catholic men has to fight decade. Women has to fight for voting for over 130 years to until after World War I. Women still fighting now for equality in getting the same salary for the same job. Minority fighting for just to get there. So what's changed here? The sense is still the same. What changes the conscience of the society and the interpretation of the text. So the meaning doesn't come only from the text, but from the conscience of the society and how it's evolved. You add another layer when you deal with the scripture, because it's a holy text. And as Marwa was talking about Sadat time, during the 50th and the 60th in Egypt, because they were talking about social justice and equality, the interpretation of the meaning of the Quran and the meaning of the Islam was talking about equality, social justice, talking about be ready for even like they were talking about communists at that time, like, you know, changing of the whole business time, business era at this time. And when Sadat came and Sadat changed his way to look for a private sector, the religious discourse itself changed. And capitalism is beginning to be a part of Islamic teaching and trade. And even verses of the Quran talking about that men created not equal. God created men in level. And the word level understood as level in different classes. The Quran itself didn't change. The meaning changed, because meaning comes from the reader themselves, not from the text alone. So what we're going to do about that, you know, according to the Muslim teaching, that all the teaching in the Quran has two structures. One of them, Quran reflecting its time of the 7th century. So you're going to find in the Quran how to handle or dealing with between men and women. Yeah, you're going to find verses in the Quran talking about inequality. You're going to find verses in the Quran talking about hitting women to discipline. And this is how the fundamental use this text to express their influence and their feeling and their power in the society. But inside the Quran too, there is the verses talking about equality between men and women. So the question is, which part you're gonna use. It's all dependent on the conscience of the society. So the main thing I think is empowering women. If you empower women, the interpretation of the Quran or the religious discourse, all of this gonna change. Because who interpreted? Who put all the rules? It's a group of men through history. Without that change, yeah, we're gonna keep going to the same idea back and forth again. And we're gonna try to fight, I think, because they have a long history of teaching and tradition behind them, so they're gonna dismiss any changes you wanna do. The other part I wanna talk about is, in Christianity and Judaism, they succeeded to differentiate between what's historic, reflecting the time and the period of the past, and what could be called divine or something expressed or moving from this time to, because you're going to find stoning in the Bible, you're going to find polygamy, and you're going to find all of this teaching. The problem with the Muslim community is they not succeeded yet to make this distinguish between what's in the Quran reflecting just the period of the 7th century and what could be passed to our time. And this is need work. But the problem is everybody is just walking on the surface from outside, fighting I think it has to do with the Muslim countries in the last 200 years. I'm going to describe it like someone whose house on fire. So when your house on fire, you're not going to think for a long term. You're always going to try to put the fire down. And when you are on fire, definitely you're going to oppress minority and women, because they are the first being put front of the fire. So it takes long time. For the last 200 years, they took for modernity just the frame. They bring the court, the legal frame, but the content of the law is the old tradition, as we heard from the first two speakers about the debate. But all of these ideas from the jurisprudence and from the interpretation of the Quran was built during an empire state. So moving from an empire state who's like has multiple background and multiple language to a national state, this change, it didn't happen yet. You could find it in the commercial law, but in the individual law, it didn't happen yet. This is why you could still find now inside Egypt, the most oppressed person in the world could be a woman, or she dark skinned and Copt, and live in the south. It's like multiple built. And we're talking about Muslim individual law and marriage. She cannot get divorced. Period. For only two reasons. Because the law who govern their marriage is held by the church. When we're talking about political discourse and religious discourse, it's the same thing. It's just different mask. We think that they are different. They are just different masks to the same dictatorship. Al-Azhar in Egypt, for example, as a most famous Muslim or Islamic teaching school, and the Orthodox Church, you always find in every event when the president there is the Copt Pope, and there is the. They are tools used in the political state to control the people. So they have to give up for them power so they could use them. So when Sadat, as Marwa said, he tried to change the constitutional part, talking about multiple, he could run for multiple time, he changed the part about the Sharia. It's give and take. They feed each other. And even I will say the institution who use religion, 100% to influence its influence is the state, the government. And the fight between the government and all these groups, Islamic political groups, is the fight who can have the sword. They are the same. The goal is the same. Just who's going to use it to control the people. So I don't know what this leads us to, but the interpretation alone is not going to make the difference. The conscience of the people, the conscience of women themselves. You could start to try to talk about women right in Egypt, and you found women in the front line to fight you. Why? Not because they don't want right, because you try to change the world familiar for them. Freedom is scary. Freedom is not something for someone who lived their life, know what's familiar, and they okay with it. When you try to change their world, they're gonna fight you. So how are you gonna deal with that? I think what this organization doing through grassroots is the way. It's gonna take no longer time, but this is what's gonna be fruitful in the future. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gamal Omar, for returning the mic to me.
On time.
Yes. Actually, you 2 minutes before time.
I can.
Yeah. Well, what you said reminded me of a conversation I had with Dr. Khalid Masoud, who is also working on Musawa and who is part of a very high religious authority of jurisprudence in Pakistan. When I was saying, yeah, it's simple. We have this verse in the Quran stating that women have this and that right. It's enough that we base our campaign on that, and then we get it. He said, no, this approach is not the right approach. Bring me a verse stating something, I'll get you a verse stating something different. Give me a hadith or a saying of the Prophet insinuating, saying something, and I will prove with another saying of the Prophet the opposite. Mm-hmm. The point in the end when you're working with Sharia is that you should see what it was meant for. That it was meant for the advancement and the progression of rights to reach equality and justice in the 7th century in this way. So we should see what is considered justice and equality in the 21st century and what it takes to do it. It depends on the reference. You agree on the reference, and then you can dig from the religion and from the practices whatever that supports that. And this what has been proven over and over again, happening in all the different countries depending on the political situation there, and they could do this, and this is why we have very different laws in various different Islamic countries. But where to go from there? Now, this year we are faced that there is even no dialogue. They said, okay, we do this year a political statement that is done behind closed doors, and you come for a fait accompli, everything's ready, and we're also wasting a wealth of knowledge that the NGOs and the civil society has. You are transpassing dialogues that are already taking place around. Why not take this further officially to have this serious dialogue of what is stopping year after year for the same arguments? Why not have the UN host something especially for that, for the discussion, and that we can provide different views from within the religion, and we have a debate, and it is not actually just to reach the right answer, but to show that, I mean, there is a richness and a very large range of opinions within the Sharia, so that we can decide on the reference in the next negotiations when the negotiation stops because of Sharia or cultural specific reasons. I will give now the mic to my colleague. We will give the chance now to the floor to come with questions.
Thank you all. It was very enlightening. I don't practice any particular religion. I am spiritual, but I was wondering, do you see women with this repressive religious attitude giving men so much advantage? Do you see less women engaging in marriage? Is there any? I can't see how women would continue to engage in marriage, but I wonder, has that lessened?
You're angry.
Thank you. I'm thinking in all religions, so considering that maybe some religions have different levels of the need of transformation. Because I think that there is a misunderstanding of what some religious messages really mean, or some old religious precepts about social and family roles based on sex affects the opportunity for girls and women, especially. I think all religions have to review these mandates that affect human rights, but how to move them forward, respecting at the same time religious freedom, and on the other hand, how to design laws and public policies free of religious issues without to impose a point of view over one sector from another sector.
And your name, please?
Elvia from Mexico.
Thank you. And
My name is Dr. Anna Marie Thomas. I'm from Brooklyn, New York, born and raised.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Carolina, and I am a deeply religious woman. And my question is, how can we support one another as deeply religious women to help one another to feel, I suppose, like emancipation? For example, I don't feel oppressed in my faith at all. I am a Latter-day Saint woman, and I came with a large group of other Latter-day Saint women that are also feel tremendously empowered in our faith, tremendously empowered in our homes and families. For example, I have 5 children, And my husband is at home with my 5 children this whole week that I'm here at this conference. So there's a tremendous collaborative feeling in our home, and it is supported by our faith. So my question is, how can, for example, my sisterhood of deeply religious women support progress and support the emancipation, I believe, of women in the Muslim community and in the Muslim faith?
Sorry, what was the faith community you're part of?
I'm a Mormon.
Mormon.
Latter-day Saint. Latter-day Saint.
Yes, please.
My name is Rita Khan. I'm from Pakistan. So a lot of what you were saying is very familiar, given that we have in Pakistan multiple levels of decades of interpretation of Islamic law. I take your point, and I agree with it totally that it is a political project, and the interpretation at any given moment is a political project, whether it's from one side or the other. The issue, and I also take the point and totally agree, I think that what the previous, what you said, is that it's actually when a religion becomes instrumentalized for everybody else that it becomes a problem, not faith in the individual. And all religions have come at a certain time and been used for political purposes over centuries, etc. My problem with in Islam is that, or in any, is that when we get into interpretation, just as in Christianity you have tons of sects, in Islam you would also have sects. Sharia is interpreted, as you said, but it can be, and therefore lead to no ultimate validation of any particular. I mean, it's basically anybody reading the Quran can decide what the interpretation is, and that can be. I mean, if you're whatever become the Sharia of any country. So when I'm just wondering how we can move away from it, so that it does not become any religion, Islam included, be a political project, but by not denying a location in faith for the individual. In other words, I'm saying let's have a secular state and let's get people get on with their own religion. But because it's coming so much in the Muslim world today, that it's going more to the right in all our countries, that how can we move into those spaces to try and shift the political process?
One more question, and then we're going to have a round of answers, and then another round of questions.
Thank you. I really appreciate what was being said about how interpretation of our religions and the individual worth that we have. If women around the world saw their individual worth, and how powerful that can make all of us, that no matter what our religion or what the politics are in our country, that individual worth will help us to understand our role as women, our proper role as women, which is wonderful and great. What I want to know is how, in the interpretation of the law, in the Quran or any other religion, are we able to help women see the interpretation and see their worth in these different scriptures, so that they can find that individual worth that they so need?
Okay, we take a round of answers, maybe 2 minutes per speaker, so that we have time to take more questions.
Okay, so maybe I'll answer some of the questions. Maybe the last question: how do we help women see their individual worth in the scripture? Well, this is where the work of I've been doing this work of engagement with religion from a rights perspective for over 20 years, and really change is not going to come from the top. Change is not going to come from the religious authorities. It's not going to come from our political leaders. It's got to come from the ground. It's got to come from the women themselves who say enough is enough. you know, and for women to confer the authority on themselves to define what their religion means to them in the context of their reality, and to enable, you know, the general population to do this, the space to discuss what religion is, what it means to us today, to build that public discourse of a religion that upholds equality and justice. There has to be a democratization of religious knowledge. It cannot remain the authority and the hegemony of the religious authorities. You know, and this is really very important. And for the democratization of religion to take place, there has to be a democratic framework. You know, and unfortunately, many of the Muslim countries supported by the American government are despotic regimes. And yet Americans expect this wonderful, progressive, democratic Islam to emerge from these despotic regimes. It's an unrealistic expectation. So that's why, like, forget about it coming from the top. And this is where the women's groups, you know, what Musawa is doing, what my group, Sisters in Islam, is doing, what so many women's groups are doing in many Muslim contexts, is really building the public voice and the public knowledge, and training, you know, groups of women, grassroots women, journalists, to really change the discourse on religion, to really expose the public that the verse on polygamy says marry only one, and that will be best for you. If you come to Malaysia now, you go to ask anybody in the streets, everyone would know this is what the verse of polygamy says, because the public education work has begun, not by the religious authorities, by women's groups who popularize this understanding through various strategies, through public education, through press conferences, through letters to the editor, to basically challenge the voice of the religious authorities and the patriarchs who really just promote this misogynistic, discriminatory discourse. What is happening in many Muslim countries today is that an alternative voice, civil society voice, activists, ordinary women are now speaking out and challenging and breaking down those barriers. You know, so that's really important. And maybe I'll just take one other point, maybe. Yeah, maybe Pakistan's serious problem in the state in Pakistan. And I think really, you know, it's unrealistic to expect religion to go away. You know, it's just not going to go away. And in Muslim countries where the constitution says Sharia is the source of law, you know, or if Sharia is not the source of all law, Sharia is the source of family law. You know, you can campaign for the complete separation of religion and state, which I think is, you know, unrealistic. You know, religion remains an important source of identity, of values for many Muslims, for Muslims. So the issue is, how do you regulate the place of religion in the public space? How do you regulate the place of religion as a source of law and public policy? And this is why, for us, this democratization of what religion means and how it's going to be used as a source of law is extremely important. Because in the end, you know, what we're discussing is public law and public policy. If it's just about religion, you offer an alternative wonderful verse, you know, this wonderful verse exists in the Quran, why can't this be the source of law? So it's about politics in the end. It's about power and about politics, you know, and so that's why it's really, I mean, going back to my point, it's really about the democratization of religious knowledge, you know, and the importance and necessity for new feminist, rights-based understanding of Islam to come out, to emerge, you know, and to basically change the whole language and discourse, you know. And I feel, I mean, it's going to take a long time. You know, it's 1,400 years of misogynistic tradition that we're trying to change. But you definitely can see the change in the discourse, you know, whether it's at the international level, at the national level, at the local, you know, more and more voices. So it's like creating these safe spaces that need to be created. And it's hard work, you know, but I do really believe that, you know, the disconnect between the realities of women's lives and a legal framework that discriminates against women, it cannot go on forever. It's got to break, and I think we're reaching that breaking point now. And so it's really important that all these voices really push the space open in different countries so that a critical mass can be built eventually.
Thank you, Zee. Thank you, Zaid. So how can women see their worth in the Quran, for example? So I think someone here was asking. My doctoral research was looking at how activists in Egypt are trying to reform the family law. And a lot of these activists are self-professed, observant Muslim women. Some of them are feminists. And for them, the Quran was a very empowering text, actually. And because they were feminist, because they already had a feminist bias, or at least, let's not say feminist, but a bias towards reading the Quran from gender-sensitive eyes, they had no problem reading the verse about beating and saying this is no longer relevant today. You know, put it aside. It's fine. It does not demean the whole value of the Quran for me, because the Quran has several other empowering aspects for women in it. So again, I want to go back to what Gamal was saying. You know, it's about your bias when you read these religious texts. All these religious texts were revealed to us in different times and spaces where beating was all right, where misogyny was normal. And it is up to us today to sift through these texts and say, okay, this is no longer good for me today, and this is okay for me today. You know, it's actually an active bias that we have to be very clear about. And that's all right. You are actually encouraged to do that by the text itself. The issue about, the sister from Pakistan, interpretation is a political project, and then you have many sects and many opinions. But I think this is the price you pay when you democratize knowledge, religious knowledge production. And in Islamic teachings, there's no church. It's directly between the Muslim and the God, immediately. And so every Muslim is empowered to read the text, think about it, decide what Islam is for them. And of course, you're right, this can create chaos. You know, you can have millions of versions of Islam going around. Now, that's not bad, actually. That's good. The problem happens when you say, I want to take this version and make it a law for all. And that's not all right. And that's why part of the democratic process is for all people to sit together. If you want to have Islam as a source of law and public policy, as Zaina was saying, then a democratic process needs to be implemented, where everyone agrees together, what is it? What are the rules of Islam that we all agree upon that will govern us? Not what this group of powerful men decide to be that will govern us, all right? So if you can't take that process, take Islam out of the public sphere. You're right, then a secular space is important. But if people agree and if people want to have religion governing their lives, then this kind of consensus building needs to happen. This democratization needs to happen. So the other thing we need to realize is that many people choose religion because it gives them something in their lives. Some people are repulsed by religion because it actually oppresses them. And that's, both sides are fine. We cannot just say, you know, we should have one religious law governing everyone, and we can't just say we have one, you know, kind of secular thing or law or rule governing us. A dialogue needs to happen, all right? And because we live in societies where religion is important, we're actually pushing forth a discourse that claims that if you want to be religious, of course you can. We realize it gives you something. But you do not have to be a second-class citizen if you're a woman and a believer and inspired by your religion. Your religion can be used as a source of empowerment and equality for you. And this is what other religious people don't like. Because what they like in religion, their version of religion, is how it discriminates against others and gives them power. So religion is also a space that is not benign always, all right? It's also, as we saw, a tool, a very good tool, to be used by those in power, whether men, politicians, religious authorities, and so on. And we need to be vigilant. So do you see women? Yeah, our Mormon sister here. So of course there needs to be solidarity and sisterhood between all, but we also need to be careful because there are issues of colonialism, the past, you know. We have a very bitter past of colonialism. And we've seen how, for example, the invasion of Afghanistan was premised on going to save the Afghani women. So there will be sensitivity, and we need to always be careful who's helping who and why. And And yes, Muslim women have their own battle to fight, but I'm sure Mormon women also have their own battle to fight, and we can help you with that. So it's important when we get into solidarity together that it comes from an equal ground to avoid these kinds of sensitivities. And this is a beautiful sentiment, and definitely let's do that. Let's work on that. There are other issues, but I'll leave the rest for Gamal.
Thank you very much, Gamal. Omar?
Yes. Your question about is anybody still want to marry? Yes, they are. And why? In a society when still economically vast majority of the people out of the economic benefit try to benefit from that. Women marriage for them is just economic surviving. It's not about the concept of someone marrying for love. It happened after the Industrial Revolution with modern education. Secularism comes with moving from agricultural society to industrial society. So when you try to implement these ideas, try to move them as they are somewhere to another place, it sometimes get resentment from, you enforcing. As Marwa was saying about invasion of Afghanistan to help them, as colonialism all the time is like helping those, modernizing and civilizing all of those people. Yeah, see, we've been through that. The issue of religion, I think the problem is not in religion. The problem in institutionalized religion. The institution work for its own benefit. The institution feed its own interest. Doesn't matter, it's, Marwa, she said, yeah, this is in the principle that there is no Pope in Islam, Sunni Islam, for example. That is that's on paper. But the fact is, all the history, there is a Pope, one way or another, in every country. It doesn't take the same shape it's having in Christianity or whatever, but it's happening. What Al-Azhar mosque happened in Egypt? What the Imam of Al-Azhar doing, sitting by the side of the president? So institutionalized religion is the problem, not religion. If religion is a understanding and interpretation from individual point of view, or even a small community's point of view, it's going to be a different issue. Institution. This is why always the state try to use those institutions to control the masses. For example, we have, maybe this is upset some of my friend, Coptic friend all the time, but Egypt is backward in religion thought, Muslim and Christian. The ideas of a religious man, a Coptic religious man, is not a big different than his equivalent of a Muslim man. This is why we have living the pain in Egypt from, social problem and economic problem taking the face of religion. And people who try to change, we have to fight this religion understanding or this religious thought or whatever. We have to start from what's inside the people's mind. If you want to make real change, don't impose your own idea, your own answer, your own solution. This is what's happened when you come, transfer with the airplane to some place. Oh, we're gonna civilize those people.
We're helping them.
We, I don't want to open this door because I keep talking forever. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I terribly apologize for the hands up that I have promised to take your questions. Unfortunately, we ran out of time and we need to be out of the room on time. But the guests, speakers, could be hanging around a little bit more, and maybe we can facilitate a small, private, smaller conversation outside of the room. I would like to thank you very much and thank all the women and their families that are linked to the civil society and the NGOs, and that are giving us the legitimacy of representation of their issues and the things they face in their life in such international arenas. And would like to thank my colleagues in Sula and the distinguished, excellent, wonderful speakers. And thank you very much for taking part of this very dynamic dialogue. And we hope